So you can hear me now?
Yes.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much. So we want to get started. We want to learn about LAN security concepts, and welcome to this class. So LAN security concepts within the local area network, there exist so many attacks, and that's why it's important that we learn as network administrators. We need to know how do we protect our network from these attacks, because within the LAN is where we find the users of the network, the clients, people who, like in an organization or in a company, the LAN is where we have the end devices. And so that's why it's important that we pay attention to it. So some of the things we shall be talking about today include endpoint security. And this is a headache for every network administrator. Every network admin wants to know how to protect their endpoints. And the endpoints basically are our end devices. These are the end devices, and protecting the end devices is the hardest job for every network administrator. Yeah, because you never know whoever is seated behind that computer. You never know what they're doing there. You never know what site they're visiting. And so we'll talk about endpoint security. We'll talk about access control. Within the LAN, how do you control access for users and access for devices? How do you control, what people are supposed to do? And how do you control which devices or which end devices should be able to access your network? And we will talk about the AAA, which is normally implemented within a server: authentication, authorization, and accounting. Then and that is for authenticating, users within the network. Then for authenticating devices within the network, we'll talk about a layer 2 protocol called 802.1x. 802.1x. These ones are used for authenticating both LAN endpoints and the devices. Then for the sake of layer 2 security threats, we are going to identify weaknesses, or as we call it in security, vulnerabilities within layer 2. And then we will talk about a very important table called the MAC address table. And this MAC address table is always under attack. And so we'll talk about some attacks that happen with the MAC address table. And then we'll talk about LAN attacks. What are some of the attacks that we find at layer 2? And remember, we are still within the OSI model, and the Ethernet, the data link layer, where we find the layer 2 switch. Remember, the layer 2 switch is the device that connects end devices to the network. And so it's a place of interest for us here. And so to start us off, let's talk about end security. And, talking about, hey, just a minute here. Talking about end security or endpoint security, I want us to do note that within an enterprise network, if today you just make a simple search, on Google, what are some of the latest network attacks? Some of the attacks that will be on top of the list will include the following three, at least they will not miss. So we have the DDoS attacks, which is the distributed denial of service attacks. This is a very sophisticated, well-coordinated attack that is always conducted and controlled from many devices or many sources. Most of these devices get infected with malware, and we call them zombies. And they have a sole intention is to deny legitimate users access to a device that they will normally be allowed to use. It could be a web server, it could be a DHCP server, it could be a DNS server, and the DNS server is always on top of the list again, or just a web server. Then the other latest attack is data breach. Okay, this is an attack whose intentions are, basically to compromise or to steal the organization's data from its data servers. All right. And then malware will be one of those in the list of your search. And this an attack in which some organizations' hosts are infected with malicious software, which causes so many things. It could encrypt the whole of the hard disk drives and prevent any access from it, or sometimes it just locks the systems until you pay a certain amount of money. And the amount of money that we pay is what we call a ransomware. WannaCry has been one of the most popular ransomware malwares that has been recorded during our times. Now, we do have security devices or network security devices which are required to protect the perimeter of our networks, okay? And these include devices like, all of us have heard about VPNs, the virtual private networks, which could be enabled on a router, or sometimes it's integrated within the firewall. We could also have the NGFW, the next generation firewall, which provides a deep packet inspection, and it could inspect so many things. It includes things like the advanced malware protection, or it could also do URL filtering so that users are actually filtered according to which websites they visit or which URLs they try to access. Other devices include the network access control, which is a device which includes both authentication, authorization, accounting, basically the AAA services. And they might include things like the Cisco Identity Service Engines, so on and so forth. So these are network devices that are on top of the list when we're talking about network perimeter security. But, we need to have some protection that, because some of those attacks could bypass those devices. And so we need to take protection to the level of the endpoint, And traditionally, we have been having, to protect these our end devices using, applications like the host-based security, host-based intrusion prevention systems, like the host-based firewall. But some of the best, protections against our endpoint devices include devices like the email security appliance for filtering all the email traffic within our network. It could be the web security appliance, which filters every single web traffic within our network. Now, like I told you guys, these endpoint devices are very, very susceptible, to malware-related attacks. And most of this malware are either transmitted through the web traffic or through the email traffic. And so there is need to have some kind of, one is access control. How can you control access to some of these devices? And this could be done either through local password creation or a server-based password creation. And so, having talked about SSH, the secure shell, many types of authentications could be performed on most of our network devices. And one of the simplest methods of authenticating remote access is to configure a login password either through the console or the VTY lines or even the auxiliary port. And so SSH is one of those that is very commonly for secure remote access. And normally SSH requires some kind of username and passwords, which could be authenticated locally, meaning we can configure it within the router itself that we need to access. We could have the passwords and the usernames configured within the router, but this comes at a cost, and that is, it comes with some limitations because sometimes user accounts configured locally, they might not be very scalable. You might not have thousands and thousands of user accounts created within our router. And sometimes you might not have a backup or a fallback plan, okay? And this could work against you. Obviously, we will remember some of these configurations here, like securing the line VTY with a password. You say line VTY 0 to 4. You say password, and we put our password there. Then, of course, we put the command login to require users to log in using this password here. And for SSH configuration, we might want to, you must put the domain name here, and the command is IP domain -name, and you put your name here, could be any domain name. Then you generate the encryption keys, and the command is crypto key generate RSA. You could stop at this point and just press enter and put the 2048 or 1024, or you could type the whole command, say crypto key generate RSA general -keys modulus, and you put the 2048 here and you press enter. And then you need to create the accounts, the usernames and passwords, and you say username is admin, and the secret here is the password, which is strong password, as configured here. And then always enable the version 2 of SSH. You say SSH version 2, and then you enable SSH on line VTY. You say transport input SSH, and you say login local. Login local means we're going to log in using the local username and passwords created here within the device. Now, this is just basic for SSH. So this is configuring the passwords within locally, just within the device, which, like I told you, has some limitations right here. Or you could also decide to create the passwords not locally within the device, but you could have a dedicated device which stores your passwords, a dedicated device for storing the passwords. And this is normally done within an enterprise network or within a big network where you cannot store all the authentications. Imagine like for in Kenya and in East Africa, we have been implementing M-Pesa, for example, as a mobile money transfer. And every M-Pesa user has his own PIN, M-Pesa PIN, and they use that PIN to be able to access the account. And we have millions and millions of M-Pesa users. And we cannot store all those millions of credentials within the router. So we need a dedicated device, for example. Or let's imagine of a government website where every user creates an account, and those accounts are just many, millions and millions of accounts, where everyone has an email and password. Or imagine of NetCard, where everyone has their own account, and you have your email address and you have your password. And so you don't want to store all those in a router. You want to dedicate those credentials and get a separate device and dedicate it to, to having store these passwords and usernames. And so we could have what is called the AAA server, which does authentication, authorization, and accounting. And it provides the primary framework to set up access control. You want to control your network devices as they access the network resources. And so AAA is a way, some people call it AAA, but we commonly refer to it as AAA. Basically, it's just a way of controlling who is permitted to access the network. So the who, to control who will access the network, that is the function of authentication. Who exactly? So who will access the network? Who is permitted? So it will identify the person. And then once they're permitted in the system, what can they do? What are they authorized to do? That is the authorization function. What can they do? Then once they have been, we have identified who the person is, we have identified what they can do while they are in the system. We must audit the actions they can perform, okay, or the actions they have performed already. We must audit what actions they performed while they were in the system, and that means they must account for their activities, and that's what we call accounting. So authentication, and accounting, correct. So that is the AAA server. The AAA server could be implemented in two ways. You might want to implement it locally within the router, where you create a password just like SSH, you create the usernames and passwords within the router. And this is normally for small networks. But for large networks, you might want to implement it outside of the router within a dedicated AAA server. This server-based method is whereby the router has to access the server for authentication, and the usernames and the passwords for all the users are stored within this server, and the router uses either of these two protocols to implement it. So either the radius, which is the remote authentication dial in user service, or it uses the TACACS plus, which is the terminal access controller, access control system, to communicate with the AAA server. So those are the two protocols that the router uses to communicate with the AAA server. So when there are multiple routers and switches, then this server-based method is more appropriate. It's more appropriate. Now, we do have what is called the 802.1x. This is a standard protocol by IEEE, and it is a post-based access control, which means computers connected to a switch, for example, and the switch could be connected to a router, you know. So you want to control access to devices, but this access, you want to control it at the port level, you know, the port entry through which your end device connects to the switch. So that connection to the switch, you want to control that particular port connecting the PCs, whether a user can be able to access the services through that computer or not. So this protocol, basically, it controls or it restricts only the authorized stations or authorized workstations or end devices to connect to a LAN through the publicly accessible switch ports. So it has three components. And so normally the end devices or the workstations, they have to be authenticated on the switch before they can be made available some of the services within the switch. So three components. The first one is what we call the client or the supplicant, as it is popularly known. So the supplicant or the client, this is the device that is running the client software for 802.1x, and it's always available for either wired or wireless devices. Okay, this is actually the device that needs to access the network resources. So that device, it must be installed with the 802.1x compliant client software. All right. Then we have the switch. This is the switch that, you know, it acts as intermediary or the mediator between the client or the supplicant and the server that will be doing the actual authentication. All right. And so what the switch does is that the switch requests access on the behalf of the supplicant to the resources of the network, but the switch must send those credentials entered on the supplicant, send them to the authentication server. Okay, and so the switch basically relays the credentials to the server and receives the responses back on whether the wired or the wireless device is accepted or authenticated or not. And then the device that does the actual, you know, authentication by checking the passwords and the usernames is what you call the authentication server, which does the actual validation of the identity of the client. And it will notify the switch or the wireless access point that the client is or is not authorized to access the LAN and the switch services. All right. So this is 802.1x, and it's important to note this is a layer 2 protocol, which, you know, validate clients at the locally available ports or the publicly available ports of the switch. Now, talking about layer 2 security threats, this is a very, very important element. And as we did learn on our OSI layer, the 7 layers, most security compromises are always done at this layer 2. But the funny thing is that most security practices, most security people, they put their security devices from layer 3 onwards. Talk about the firewalls, talk about, the web security appliances and the mail security appliances. Basically, they protect layer 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, not 8, up to 7. Layer 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay. So we protect those upper layers and we forget about layer 2. And that is a very dangerous layer. And so most of the solutions that we put here do not take care of layer 2. Yet layer 2 is the most vulnerable of all the layers. And compromising layer 2 shuts down or compromises all the layer 3 to 7. And that's why we need to pay attention to layer 2. We need to pay much attention to layer 2. Why is it so? It's because layer 2 has so many protocols which can be made very vulnerable when they fall to the hands of very sophisticated threat actors or hackers. Okay. And there's this saying, old saying, which goes that security is only as strong as the weakest link within the system. And so layer 2 is always considered to be that weak link within the network. And this is because most LANs were traditionally under the control of just a single organization. And we trusted all people and devices who connect to the LAN. And we know that today we have things like IoT, things like bring your own device, and we have had hackers who have developed many skills that could be used to take away layer 2. And so we have these attacks. The first one is called the MAC address table attacks. And obviously, those attacks attack the MAC address table of the switch. We have the VLAN attacks, which include things like the VLAN hopping and VLAN double tagging. We have DHCP attacks, where we also have 2 attacks, DHCP starvation attacks and DHCP spoofing attacks. Then we have ARP attacks, ARP attack, which includes the ARP spoofing and ARP poisoning attacks. Then we have address spoofing attacks, where we spoof either the MAC addresses and also the IP addresses. And finally, we have the STP attacks. Most of these are layer 2 protocols. So STP, which is spanning to protocol, could be manipulated as well. And so we want to start by talking about at least each and every of these attacks and just be able to see how to do that. But before I do that, let me just talk about what are some of the mitigation techniques. How do we prevent some of these attacks? Attacks that attack the MAC address table or DHCP attacks, we could protect them using what we call port security, and we are going to configure port security in our next section. Then we have DHCP attacks, starvation and spoofing. So DHCP starvation and DHCP spoofing, we can prevent them using what is called DHCP snooping. Snooping prevents spoofing. Spoofing is the attack. Snooping is the prevention technique or the solution or the mitigation technique. Then we have ARP spoofing and ARP poisoning attacks, prevented using what is called the dynamic ARP inspection or DAI. Then the spoofings on the IP and MAC addresses is prevented using the IP source card, IPSG. And so there also exist other layer 2 solutions. And these layer 2 solutions are used to supplement, those mitigation techniques I've just mentioned. And this includes strategies like using secure versions of our protocols like SSH instead of Telnet, or using what is called the SCP, the Secure Copy Protocol, SFTP, the Secure FTP, and for websites, HTTP, we might want to use either SSL, the Secure Socket Layer, or TLS, the Transport Layer Security. Normally, use SSH for remote access of your devices only if you must. Otherwise, if the device is somewhere accessible, please get used to using out-of-band solutions, like using the console cable, where you don't have to do it over the network. For VLANs, it's important that you use dedicated management VLAN. Do not use VLAN 1. Create another VLAN to use other than VLAN 1 for management purposes and configure it with the IP addresses. As much as possible, configure access control list, ACLs, to filter unwanted access. And we shall be having a whole chapter on SCL, so do not worry so much about that. Now, let's talk about the MAC address table. And this is something that we have talked about before on our during the module 1. And you know that the MAC address table, which is also called the content addressable memory table, is found in the switch. And the switch stores two things within the MAC address table. Normally, it stores the MAC address of our end devices and the port numbers. The source MAC addresses and the port numbers are some of the two very important details stored on the MAC address table. So every device, every end device connected to the switch, before they can send any message through the switch, the switch must record the MAC address, and the switch must also record the port numbers through which they are connected on the switch. And so this table sometimes will be compromised by hackers, and they have mastered the art normally of doing that. And so the hackers will do something that we call a MAC address flooding attack. And so what happens, the MAC address flooding attack could be done in such a way that we know that the MAC address can only store up to a maximum. It has a limit of the number of MAC addresses it can store, okay? And so what the hackers will do is that they will overwhelmingly keep on sending messages to the switch and bombarding the MAC address table until the MAC address table is full, so that every time a switch receives a new message or a new frame or packet which is having a new MAC address, the switch will treat that frame as a known unicast, and it will begin now to flood it out of all ports, okay? And so that frame will be sent without referencing to the MAC address table. Reason being, the MAC address table is full and it can never store any new MAC addresses on its table. And this condition will allow the threat actor to now capture all the frames that are sent from one host to another host within the local area network. And the threat actor can capture traffic within the LAN, or normally this is within the same VLAN, and this can prevent all the other users now, because the users won't be able to send any more messages on the switch, because the switch will be doing just flooding of messages. And so using tools like the Markov tool, other users will be on a denial of service attack, okay? Because they wouldn't be able to browse. So trying to browse on this particular network, you will actually see the browser just loading and loading and loading, because the basic functional unit of the switch has been compromised, which is the MAC address table. And other attacks include attacks on the VLAN for layer 2, where we have the VLAN hopping attacks, the VLAN hopping attack. We know that the switch is always configured with VLANs. We know that, okay? And so what happens is that the link between any two switches must always be configured as a trunk. And the reason we configure the links between switches with the trunks is to allow VLANs from one switch to communicate with the VLANs on another switch. And so a very good example will be like in this diagram, we do have server 1 here on VLAN 10 and server 2 on VLAN 20, all right? And so the trunk links here is supposed to allow VLAN 10 and 20 all to pass the traffic through this trunk here, going to other devices that might be on this VLAN. And so what the threat actor wants to achieve is one. The threat actor is going to configure his computer here to look like a switch, right? And these are hacking techniques, all right? The threat actor is going to configure his PC to look like a switch. And the objective is such that the switch is going to automatically form this PC, having been configured to look like a switch, is going to form an illegal trunk here. So an authorized trunk is going to form between these two devices. And so this PC is now able to access traffic from both VLAN 10 and VLAN 20. And that is bad news for this network. Because once this hacker does that, he can be able to manipulate, he can access, and he can be able to eavesdrop or listening on traffic coming from both server 1 and server 2. And those are not things you really want to happen in your network. So the threat actor is going to spoof his PC, okay? So that using the protocol called DTP, so that the PC now looks like a switch, and the threat actor now can actually be able to hop from one of the VLAN, from VLAN 10 to 2010 to 2020 to 10 and access traffic. And that's a very dangerous one. Now, for VLAN double tagging attack, this is whereby the threat actor is using, we know that the native VLAN is normally the VLAN that is used within the trunk, okay? Within the trunk, the trunk between these switches here, the trunk is always configured with a native VLAN, where we say switch port mode trunk, then you say switch port trunk native VLAN 99, for example. So what the VLAN does, the native VLAN does, is that it carries traffic from other VLANs as well. And the traffic passing there is actually untagged. And so what will happen is that the threat actor will connect its devices to the same VLAN as the native VLAN of the trunk, okay? And the idea is to allow the attacker to send data to hosts or servers on the VLAN that would otherwise be blocked by some type of access control configuration. So he makes his, the threat actor makes the link between his laptop to the network to look like a trunk, so that he evades detection by some access control configurations, okay? And so the traffic will be permitted since it is native traffic using the native VLAN, and it gives the attacker the ability now to communicate with the devices on the normally devices that will be blocked. And so some of the mitigation for this is that the user needs always disable trunking on ports that are connected to end devices. We call them access ports. Then also disable automatic trunking on links, automatic trunking or auto negotiation by using the command switch port no negotiate. Now make sure the native VLAN is only used for trunk links, only that, not any other link. So two types of VLAN attacks is VLAN double tagging and VLAN hopping attacks, VLAN double tagging and VLAN hopping attacks. Then for DHCP, very, very important, we normally have two attacks for DHCP. We did learn that, VHCP is the protocol that dynamically or automatically provides IP information And that can include IP addresses, default gateways, subnet mask, DNS server addresses, domain names, so on and so forth. So DHCP normally exchanges, as we know, 4 messages between the client and the server. And we could see those 4 messages. We gave them the name DORA, whereby the client sends a DHCP discover message to any nearby servers within the network, saying, I would like to request some IP information. The first server to receive that message will respond with an offer, and the offer contains all the details that the client needs: the duration of time to use that IP, the IP itself, subnet mask, default gateways, DNS. So the offer is sent to the client. The client cannot use that offer, excuse me. The client can't use that offer immediately. The client has to send another message called the DHCP request, okay, saying, I accept this IP address. I accept this IP address offer. And the server has to acknowledge that request, and the server will send the DHCP acknowledgement message, which says your acceptance is acknowledged. And now the PC can go on and use that message. Now, so what happens is that the DHCP can have 2 types of attacks, and these attacks could normally occur in sequences. The first one is the DHCP starvation. You know that the DHCP server contains a pool of IP information or IP addresses where the clients could be picking from. And so what the hacker will first do is to starve the DHCP server, all right, to exhaust all the IP information unnecessarily. So the hacker makes sure that he sends fake requests to the DHCP server until the server assigns all the addresses it has, and it remains empty, all right? Once it exhausts or leases all the addresses, it is now an opportunity for the hacker to pose and to pretend to be the new DHCP server in town. And so the server is going to spoof or to pretend to be the server, and the hacker will pose his laptop to be a fake DHCP server. We call it a rogue DHCP server, where the hackers, the client devices are still going to send their IP request, but only the server they'll find is a fake server, which is going to offer fake or misleading information, including wrong IP addresses, wrong default gateways, and wrong DNS servers. And by using this information, a client will be redirected to fake or malicious websites, or we call it nefarious websites, where either the client device will download malware or will be infected, basically. And so the DHCP starvation and the DHCP spoofing attacks are always following each other. Then, of course, we have attacks that happen on the ARP table. To just as a reminder, ARP means Address Resolution Protocol. This is a small table that is found either on a PC or on a router. So what ARP does is that the ARP table, or the ARP table, as some people call it, the ARP table stores 2 things. It stores the MAC address and IP addresses, MAC and IP addresses of our end devices. And so what happens is that every time a PC wants to communicate to another device, that PC must first store the MAC and IP addresses of the device it needs to communicate to, if that device is within the same network. If that device is outside of the scope of its network, then it only needs to know the address of the default gateway, all right? And so what happens is that that table could be compromised. Remember, if a PC or a client device doesn't know the MAC address of a device it needs to communicate to, and in most cases, it will always know the IP, because since they are on the same network, the IP addresses will be belonging to the same network address and subnet mask. And so the PC is always knowing the IP address. What it normally doesn't know is the MAC address. So to get the MAC address of a device whose IP is known, the client devices will send an ARP request or the ARP request message, which is a broadcast message sent to all the devices within the subnet requesting, and the most message could be saying something like, who is the owner of this IP address? Kindly provide your MAC address, something like that. And when you use Wireshark to be able to do that, you'll always see who is messages. And maybe this could be a good time for me to demonstrate this particular activity. Let me open my Wireshark here. And so as my Wireshark is opening, I don't want to install new updates. Since I'm on my Wi-Fi network and you can see its active graph is just beginning to form, I'll just double click on the Wi-Fi to open my Wireshark, all right? And one of the messages that you're likely to see is the who is messages. Who is messages? And I might want to, let me just check the ARP table of my PC. I'll just say ARP space -A, and you can see some of the this is the content of my ARP table here, and it of course includes my broadcast IPs here. And one of the devices whose IP must be here is my default gateway, and the MAC address of my default gateway, obviously, it's here. And there are other devices here, like 0.106 is here. But what I want to do is that I would like to check if my PC could be able to know the IP address of my mobile phone here, which is within the same network. And so the IP address of my phone currently is, let me just put it on same network here. I want to remove it from the mobile network. And so it's in a minute, it will be done. Correct. So my IP is 192.168.0.102, and you can't see it here. You cannot see that IP here currently, .102. But if I want it to be here, then I'm gonna ping my phone, and I say my phone is 192.168.0.102. All right. And by pinging it, I know, I'm very sure that my PC, for it to send those ICMP messages to my phone, and you can see the replies coming from my phone are here. I am now certain that the IP address of my phone .102 must be on the ARP table. All right. And let me just do that. And you can see 102 is now here. This is the IP address of my mobile phone. And how do I know that? I can check my Wireshark network, and I can check on, I can just filter here for ICMP messages. And you can see some echo requests and echo reply. These are the pings that I had sent. Let me talk about ARP, the ARP messages, and I could do that right here. And you can see these are the messages I needed you guys to see. All right. So let's take, for example, I want to take the ARP messages that were asking the IP address of my phone. And you can see that very clearly here. Look at this. Who has this one. This was an ARP message which was sent as a broadcast from my computer to my phone, and my computer is actually 1.110. This is the IP address. And so my computer was, or the ARP protocol was saying, who has this IP 0.102? Please tell 0.110. And so look at what my phone is replying. Okay. My phone replies that I am 102 and my MAC address is actually here. All right. This is a very good one. And my phone also sent an ARP request, asking my laptop that who has 110, and my phone was told, who has 110? Please tell my mobile phone at 102. And you can see my laptop has responded also that the MAC address of my laptop is actually this one here. And these gadgets communicate so much, and they communicate like human beings, and this is one of the amazing things. And Wireshark is such a Wireshark is such a very important gadget normally to be able to use to watch some of these things that we are talking about here. And you can see this is an ARP reply that was here, and the ARP request was actually here. And just trying to check on something here. All right. And and you can see it's my gadget that actually sent that ARP request here. And the device is on Wi-Fi here. And it was actually a mobile phone. Might not be very visible here. But you understand whatever it is I'm talking about. Of course, you can see my laptop is Intel Core here, and it was receiving that app request, So I hope you see what I'm talking about. Now, this process, my phone and my laptop, they cannot exchange messages with each other if they don't know each other's MAC addresses. Since they are on the same network, they will always know each other's IP, but they don't know each other's MAC addresses. Now, that table could actually be compromised, okay? So what the threat actor could do is to send some fake ARP messages. We call them the gratuitous ARP messages, which contain some spoofed MAC addresses. And that could be sent to either the switch or any other device. And so what will happen is that by sending, you are asking who is the owner of this MAC address. What the hacker's laptop will do is the hacker will respond by giving a fake response to a legitimate request. So my phone could be asking by sending a broadcast message, who is the owner of this IP? And since my phone is asking the owner of an IP to respond with the MAC address, the hacker's laptop could actually respond with a fake response, pretending to be my laptop, for example, okay? And my phone will store that message in its ARP table so that the next time my phone wants to send something to my laptop, it doesn't send it to my laptop. It is actually sent to the hacker's laptop. And that is a way that the hacker could always compromise the ARP protocol, okay? And that's an ARP attack. And so that kind of spoofing, ARP spoofing, could be mitigated using what is called the dynamic ARP inspection, the dynamic ARP inspection. And so that is, of course, includes both the ARP, spoofing could be done on the IP itself, or it could be done on the MAC address. And apart from the dynamic ARP inspection, the IP source guard could be used to, to prevent IP spoofing attacks. So the spoofing can either be on the MAC address or on the IP address. Finally, we have what is called the STP, the spanning tree protocol, where what the hacker, since we already talked about the STP, and we did talk about the root bridge especially, and we talk about the election of the root bridge, which normally happens first. Then we have the election of the root ports, designated ports, and even the alternate ports. And what the hacker would normally do is to spoof his laptop to look like a switch, and go on and elect his fake switch, which is his laptop, to become a root bridge. And this is going to interfere with the whole topology of the network. And the hacker could then capture all the traffic intended for the immediate switch within the network. And so this manipulation could actually see STP use the bridge protocol data units to block either wrong ports within the network, or just sending a fake request, announcing the hacker's laptop to be elected as the root bridge. And so to mitigate this, we need to implement things like the BPTU guard, and also the what is called the spanning tree. We have the BPTU guard, and I don't know. I'll remind you of the other one. This BPTU guard and the port fast. Yes, port fast is the other protocol. Finally, we have this layer 2 protocol called the CDP, the Cisco Discovery Protocol. This is a protocol which lets Cisco devices to be able to discover details about other Cisco devices within the network. All right. And this will include things like IP addresses, the software version of the iOS, the type of platform, the capabilities, it a switch or a router, including even the native VLANs. And data received from one device to another device about other devices will be used by the threat actor to manipulate the network. For example, the hacker manages to access one of your Cisco switches in the network. He can now use that switch to learn about the details of the other devices within the network, the Cisco devices. And the closest sister, CDP is used only for Cisco devices, but the sister of CDP, which can be used in all the devices from all the vendors, is called LLDP, the Link Layer Discovery Protocol, which is also used to discover information about other devices within the network. So it is very important to mitigate some of these attacks that happen with either CDP or LLDP. And you could just do something like, disable CDP, for example. You could say to stop CDP messages from being sent through the all interfaces, you could disable CDP globally by saying no CDP run. And of course, that means the command for enabling CDP globally on your switch or a router is CDP run. You could also disable CDP on the interfaces. You will just say no CDP enable on the interface to prevent a specific port from forwarding CDP messages. That means the command for enabling CDP on an interface is CDP enable. LLDP, instead of saying LLDP run or no LLDP run, no CDP run, you say LLDP run or no LLDP run. Now, for LLDP, normally, unlike CDP, which uses one command on the interface, just saying CDP enable, LLDP must use two commands, must use LLDP transmit and LLDP receive. And that means to stop or to disable LLDP on an interface, you must say no LLDP transmit, and then you also say no LLDP receive on an interface. Now, I do want us now at this moment in time to make some configurations. We want to do some configurations on some of those protocols we've actually talked about. Some of those details we've talked about, I want us to do some configurations within the next